From Chicago's CAN TV, this is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there. Welcome to Chicago Newsroom, everybody. Here on CAN TV, I'm Ken Davis. On what's turned out to be a crazy busy week in Chicago, we've got a more or less complete consent decree for police reform, a mayoral race that gets more erratic by the minute with about 15 "I'm thinking about it" announcements and about 20 "I'm honored but don't think I can serve at this time" announcements. But the field really does seem to be clearing with a handful of the big guys still standing, so we are going to talk about that. And as we are recording our show on Friday, September 14th at 9:30 a.m., we've just discovered that, the lawyers and jurors are all assembling in Judge Gaughan's courtroom, and they have heard the news that Jason Van Dyke has elected for a jury trial. So we have a hotel strike going into its second week, a debate over police officers in the public schools, a repentant Bruce Rauner, and a tweet, that tweet from you-know-who claiming that the death toll in Puerto Rico was fake news to make him look bad. It's so busy this week we had to call in 3 experts. No waiting. 3 experts, no waiting. Kathy Chaney is joining us, Sun-Times assistant engagement editor at the Sun-Times. So we're going to find out what that is. So great to have you back again.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Really so happy to have you back here at the table. Miguel Del Valle joining us again after a couple of years, I think it's since you've been here.
Yes, it has.
Former state senator, of course, for about 20 years. You were city clerk for a couple of terms. You've done so many things. It would take the rest of the hour to list them all.
Former Illinois Commerce Commission member.
That too. That also, yes, and also a candidate for mayor back in 11, right? It was the first round.
That was the first Emmanuel.
Yeah.
Campaign.
So here's a guy who, everything we're going to talk about today, he's either done it, been there, or has vast experience in it, including the Puerto Rico thing that I want to talk to you about. So we'll get to all of that. Also, our friend A.D. Quig is back here from the Daily Line, out today with a very nice piece of work listing all of the consent decree monitors who are applying for the job. So we've got a lot to talk about. Should we start? You know what? Let's, just for the fun of it, let's start with Puerto Rico, shall we?
Puerto Rico.
Yeah.
Okay.
Donald J. Trump. 3,000 people did not die in the 2 hurricanes that hit Puerto Rico. When I left the island after the storm had hit, they had anywhere from 6 to 18 deaths. As time went by, it did not go up by much. Then a long time later, they started to report really large numbers, like 3,000. This was done by the Democrats in order to make me look as bad as possible when I was successfully raising billions of dollars to help rebuild, blah, 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 blah.
Such a ridiculous
You were born
statement.
in Puerto Rico.
Yes, I was in Puerto Rico, and I have relatives there that were very much affected. But that is such a ridiculous statement that not one person, I didn't see anyone, either on the Democratic side of the aisle or the Republican side of the aisle, stand with him on that statement. Everyone was running away from it. And you recall that during those days, during the aftermath of the hurricane, the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, was on cable news constantly saying, "This is horrific, this is terrible, we need help." And she was basically ignored. And even more interesting than that is that the governor of Puerto Rico, Rosselló, was really reluctant to criticize FEMA and the administration. He is from the party in Puerto Rico that is kind of like the equivalent to the Republican Party here. So he was really careful. And now that the study has shown that there were almost 3,000 deaths, now he's being critical of the Trump administration and of the president. And so I just want to mention that Mayor Cruz in San Juan was the one that spoke out the loudest about what was happening, and many people weren't believing her at the time.
Right.
They thought she was exaggerating.
Yeah. Obviously, this is all in the backdrop of Hurricane Florence, and we're all keeping in our thoughts all the people who are evacuated from the southeast, and who knows, at the time that we're recording, we just don't know how bad it's going to get, but it's already bad, and it will probably get a lot worse. And that brings, of course, FEMA into mind and the, I think we could all agree, horrible job that they did in Puerto Rico.
And FEMA has acknowledged that. So the director of FEMA has acknowledged that there were serious problems.
Yeah.
And you have President Trump saying, no, everything was great. It was a great.
I threw a bunch of paper towels at a lot of people. We fixed it.
Oh,
We
that
cleaned it up.
was insulting, to say the least.
Oh, yeah, I guess so. Anybody want to finish this off, or should we move on?
I think it's just interesting that the administration has consistently said one thing and Trump has said another, and we're seeing it over and over and over again. And this one is particularly egregious because there were so many lives lost.
Yeah, and you had no less than Paul Ryan kind of doing a sort of a mealy mouth, there's evidence that the numbers are pretty high or something like that. So yeah, even his own people. Shall we talk about the consent decree first? Shall we talk about the mayoral race first? Shall we talk about the hotel race? You decide. Kathy Chaney, you're an editor. For God's sake, help us out here. What's the most important thing we should talk about?
You know, one burning question that I have about the whole mayoral thing is we've got all these people that are coming out saying, you know, I think about it, I'm going to do it, no, I don't want to do it. Why now? What is it, because Emmanuel said that he wasn't running again?
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if he was running again, would you still jump in the race? So that's the question that I have
Exactly.
is, were you scared,
Yeah.
you know, to go against him? Why are people scared to go against him? So now that he's not running, everyone is so interested. So that it's the question that I have is, what were you scared of before? If you were very passionate about jumping in the race and, you know, leading your city, you would have done it. You know, you would have jumped in whether he was going for it or not.
But, and you're in the media, so I have to ask you, why is the media paying attention, so much attention, to individuals that say, I'm thinking about it? I think the media attention is bringing more people out of the woodwork.
Absolutely.
And so, by the way, I want to announce today that I will not be having a press conference to announce that I am not running for mayor.
You heard it here first on Chicago Newsroom, our first exclusive. He will not have a press conference to announce that he's not. And that's big news because you ran and came in third against Rahm Emanuel. So
that's
more than
right.
all these other people, you've actually run against Rahm
That's right.
Emanuel.
Yes.
So I don't know. I mean, I have the same question too. It's like, okay, sometimes when I see like the news releases come about, I'm like, okay, so, and,
Right.
you know, why are we caring? You know, and I know that we have to put it out because, you know, they said it or whatever, but I don't like, you know, reporting on a lot of candidates all the time that just say, hey, I'm thinking about it, I want to do it. When you are bona fide, come talk to me. Let's really have the discussion. Let's put it out there. But there are just so many that are
Well,
out there coming out
When
now.
you file 36,000
Yeah.
signatures and you get on the ballot, then you're a serious candidate.
Exactly. That's when we can talk. But until then, you know, I'm with you on that. It's like we've got to push out everyone that's out there, and then sooner or later will come out. They didn't get enough signatures, or they're backing out and gonna, you know, back someone else, and it gets tiring, extremely tiring. Because if you look at this, there's so many faces on here, and that's changed since that was published. Right.
And this is sometimes from a week ago, and this is yesterday's Defender. Even the Defender's getting in the act now with who's currently in the race, and I think we can put crosses over some of these people
Exactly.
already. Louis Gutierrez has said no, and you know. Anyway, but the question that's in front of us right now is, what is this phenomenon that we're seeing of like the big lions like Tony Preckwinkle and you know Susana Mendoza, probably who knows, maybe Chuy Garcia, sort of like the big three now that are sort of maneuvering into place. First of all, can they get 30,000 signatures?
Yes.
They can.
Yes.
That's so. You think they have a good?
Yes, all three of them
All
have
three of them have a good
established
shot.
political organizations. Mark Brown wrote about this really well earlier this week about the work and the team you need in place to pull this off. All of them, Tony Preckwinkle's been around for a long time, Chuy Garcia's been around for a long time, Susana Mendoza's been around for a long time. They all have the teams in place and can probably people have a lot of faith that if Susana Mendoza wanted to do it in the last 3 weeks of petition passing, she could.
She could. And of course, that's an interesting, delicate one, because she's running for
All the big
controller.
three are.
Yeah, all of them are running for other offices.
Yeah.
But hers is a little bit different, because if Bruce Rauner wins as governor and she gives up her job as controller, where she's one of the sort of the big Democratic balances against him, he'll be able to appoint his own controller.
I'm sure that's on her mind.
So that's part of the reason why she's being more careful, right?
Yes, and you don't want to get into this thing unless you think you're going to win.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
there's so many people, we don't know whether they're in or out. And you also have kind of the ancillary supporters saying, well, I don't want to back a loser either. So
Yeah.
we kind of have a chicken or egg problem where someone like Tony Preckwinkle is making a bunch of calls to unions and
Yeah,
other elected
yeah.
officials and saying, will you back me? And they're like, well, I don't know yet. A few other people might get in. I want to back a winner.
Well, and I don't think that you can discount those that announced their candidacies before Emmanuel
Exactly.
Yeah,
made
that's
the
true.
decision.
Yeah.
And so Lori Lightfoot and Paul Vallis, I think, can't be discounted here.
Yeah,
They remain serious candidates.
I think a lot of people have made this point that there are people who were, use the word, courageous enough to stand up against Rahm Emanuel and to say, I'm going to run against you. And in a way, they kind of deserve a sort of a slightly higher level of admiration for what they're doing. But the fact of the matter is that their candidacies, let's face it, are not as promising as the candidacies of, this other top three of Preckwinkle, Mendoza, and Garcia. So that figures in it too. We really are. I mean, I'm running all over the place here, but I think about Troy LaRaviere, for example, who we had on the show a week or two ago. And I find him to be an incredibly fascinating, dynamic guy with a lot of really good ideas. Whether or not he could move right into the mayor's office is another question altogether, but he's a good, intelligent guy with a lot of ideas. People like that are just going to be swept out into the sea as this dynamic changes.
Well, we were already talking about the media problem of covering everyone that's in or out. This was already a race with 15 people in it, which makes it very hard to talk about the issues because the horse race aspect of it is so compelling to read that we don't know what everyone's plan for property taxes are. We don't know what everyone's plans for schools are. We don't know what everyone's plans for public safety is. And now it's only worse because we have the 20 other maybes that we have to cover.
And speaking of Troy, I rarely hear him out, saying anything. So I hear about Jamal Green. He's very vocal. You hear about Willie Wilson, but Troy, I don't hear enough about him. He's not vocal enough for me, and I really wish that he would start that because it gives people something to think about when they're thinking about all the other candidates who jumped in before Emmanuel said that he wasn't going to run.
That's another very good example. Jamal Green, who on the face of it, you'd say, well, he's kind of young and inexperienced, we're not going to be taking him seriously. Sat down for an hour and talked to him, and he, like so many others, he's got some really good, solid ideas. These are not people to be just dealt with lightly and dismissed. They're serious thinking people.
Right. And then that's the disadvantage for candidates like that, where you say you don't hear his voice, but he doesn't have the campaign structure to be able to get out there and put out lots of press releases and schedule media interviews. He relies on earned media. Whenever he gets a shot, he'll take it. But that puts all of these candidates who have good ideas and are sincere at a real disadvantage. And then those that are well known, in this particular case, even those will get less attention because of such a crowded field. Chuy is a good friend of mine. I think he'd make a good mayor. But in the last campaign, I said to Chuy after it was over, you need to put some people in place that are going to give you some really solid advice on city finances, for example. I think that was a weak spot in his last campaign.
That was arguably his downfall.
It may be his downfall. If that repeats itself, then he'll have a difficult time again. Even though I think that with the right people, with the right resources, he can put together a message that is clear and one that will win over voters and win their confidence, because that right now is one of the biggest issues. Besides the violence in the neighborhoods, the finances in the city are
I'm so glad we were able to get you to come to the show today, because you really have this perspective. I mean, when Luis Gutierrez was bouncing around a little bit about the idea of running for mayor, and then he says no and throws it, he wants Chuy Garcia. I mean, you guys are all contemporaries. You all have known each other for a long time. And I can't help but think that Chuy Garcia does himself damage if he gets really serious about doing this mayor thing, because he's already gone through the primary. He's said that he wants to go to D.C. He wants to be our congressman, right. And now to just suddenly say, well, there's something I want more than that, it doesn't feel good, and I think that does a lot of damage.
Well, I think that he could still do the job, and I think he would receive a lot of support within the Hispanic community. But you'll recall that the African American vote went primarily Emmanuel's way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's going to be different this time around, of course. But if Quig was in the race, I would see her capturing most of the African American vote, and then Willie Wilson will do well because
Dorothy Brown will do well
because he's done well in campaigning. He was out there early. He has resources, and then Dorothy is always a big vote getter, even though her circumstances have changed too since the last race. So we'll certainly see who comes out ahead, but. There are people out there who are counting on that African American vote splitting.
Yeah, well,
and
yeah,
it could happen.
It could very well happen. It's like we have too many people to choose from. And Willie, he got what? He went into double digits in the percentage. Yeah,
that's right.
And he's
which
polling
was a
well.
shocker.
And he's polling well
last
now.
time.
In fact, it's sort of weird because people tend to just dismiss Willie Wilson, but when you look at all of these polls, that everybody's been doing polls, it's weird how Willie Wilson often shows up in like third place, and it's just he's got a lot of support.
He's also got a lot of earned media from those weeks and weeks of him.
Oh, absolutely.
The passing out the cash accusations at church.
So I'll throw out a really controversial idea. Is it possible that this might be our first sort of post-racial, post-ethnicity election in Chicago? Is it possible that it doesn't even matter as much? Because if the black vote is sort of weirdly split between Dorothy Brown and Willie Wilson and another candidate like maybe Tony Preckwinkle, I'm not so sure that we see a monolithic Latino vote in Chicago. We haven't for a while. I don't know that, maybe if Chuy Garcia got it, he would, I don't know. White people. Look at McCarthy. What does McCarthy do? McCarthy grabs a lot of the white vote, perhaps. But I, instead of looking at it that way, I'm looking at it as we may actually be maturing into a city where people are going to look at people just for what their politics are instead of what their background is.
Yes, but times are different from the first time Emmanuel. There's more awareness of the neglect. From City Hall for the West Side and the South Side. There's more awareness of the imbalance that exists, of the inequities that exist, and the violence that is caused in part by those inequities. And so people are going to be asking, can this person address those issues? Are they just going to be paying lip service to it? I think you're going to have a much more serious voter out there this time around.
I think that's right, and I would build on that by saying that I think that in a lot of there's always been a sort of a progressive white community, the lakefront liberal types, but I'm thinking that there is more of an awareness among sort of middle of the road white people about the fact that when you see this intractable violence, it's more than just we need more cops. Right. I think that you can stop like I said, just sort of middle of the road white people on the street now and say, why is this violence happening? And they're not going to just say, well, it's because we don't have enough cops. They're going to say, well, it's because of education and maybe not go all the way down into disinvestment, but still the idea that we have a lot of people who've been treated unfairly.
And people who know that, for example, if Amazon comes in, that those jobs aren't going to go.
That's right.
To the neighborhoods.
Well, and they're also not going to go to those middle class white people.
And
either.
they're not going to
they're
go.
They're not going to anybody. They're going to be bringing other people in.
Other people in,
Right.
and when they see all the downtown development continuing, and
Right.
particularly residential development, they know that that's for the purpose of attracting primarily professional people who are going to get six-figure salaries and do well and buy houses and rent units that are going to cause further displacement and increased gentrification.
And I don't think that we can discount the Generation Z and millennial voters, because I think that they will be a huge factor in this.
I do too.
So you're black
If
and
they
you're
vote.
Hispanic. Well, I think that they are more conscious now, and like you're saying, they're becoming more aware of the issues. And then you've got high-profile millennials and Generation Z. You've got Chance the Rapper that's very vocal and mobilizing his base and others that are around him. You have a lot of the activists. You've got Jamal Green with his activist base. I think they will be a huge deciding factor for this mayoral race and actually just voting, period. So I wouldn't be surprised if they will be the deciding factor, and it's not just say, okay, the black vote is split or the Hispanic vote is split and you need them. But I think that that Generation Z and the millennial activist base will be very crucial.
Well, let's be explicit about this now. Are you talking about a generation across race, or are you talking about African American Generation Zs?
A generation across race, because mostly when you see, and I've covered like 99% of all the demonstrations, social justice and everything out there, and who you see the black activists, you see Hispanic activists, you see very few white. They are there though, they are there, but the core is black and Hispanic, and I think that that will be very telling with this.
I want to explore this just a little bit further, because you raise an interesting question for me, that the Dan Ryan protest, when it became, and we're treading in some very sensitive areas here, but when it became a little bit clearer to white people who are sympathetic that it might be safe for them to do this, that they were going into a neighborhood that's considered to be dangerous for them and they wouldn't normally go there, a lot of white people showed up for that demonstration. And this is what makes me believe that, unlike elections in the past, there is a good deal more white sympathy for these kinds of issues than there has been in the past. It might not show up in explicit ways, but it might show up, especially when you talk about the power of younger voters, it might show up on election day.
I will say that the sympathy.
Didn't mean to put you on the spot, but you know, you're Studs Terkel Award winner, so you have to. We have to.
I mean, so like I said,
congratulations, by the way.
Thank you very much. Like I said, I've covered about 99% of the demonstrations over the last few years, and there's always a good contingent of white activists that are out there, always. But the core is black and Hispanic. I will say that the regular white activists that come in the communities to go march, they're not scared to come, and they come. They're there. I would say where the Dan Ryan protest was, the march, I guess you could say it's a dangerous neighborhood. I live in a neighborhood, I live like about maybe 5 minutes away from there. I don't think anyone was really scared to come there. They were there for the mission. And you have that dedicated core activist who will go in the trenches with you no matter what.
And there's that dedicated core of white activists.
Exactly.
The same people you saw at the Lakeshore Drive protest and at the O'Hara protest.
Yes.
That needs to grow.
Absolutely.
I know visually on TV it looked at times where there were more whites than there were
Yeah. Sometimes
African Americans
it
and
does.
Latinos.
Yes.
And some people say, well, that's a good sign, and it is a good sign. But the folks who work downtown and who live on Lakeshore Drive and who live in Wrigleyville and other parts in Streeterville, those are the folks that are voting their pocketbooks. And they're the ones who helped put Emmanuel in office.
He was their mayor, yeah.
He was their mayor, and they want to see that continued downtown development. And yes, they're concerned about violence, but they want a good fiscal manager in that spot because it affects their pocketbook.
So one of the phrases that we hear all the time is, ready on day one, right? Who's ready on day one to be mayor of Chicago? Is there anybody?
I think Toni Preckwinkle would be ready. She's run an executive office for 8 years. I think Chuy Garcia, knowing what he learned after the last election, he's also had a raised profile both on the Cook County Board and in politics nationally. I know Paul Vallis believes he would be ready on day one.
I wasn't asking what he believes. And of course, you're a working reporter, you're a working editor, so we have to be careful here. I'm not asking you for your personal opinions, but from what you have gathered in your work and talking to people, I'm just wondering if you think there are people who really could just walk into that office and take command. I would argue that Rahm Emanuel was not ready on day one.
I think Rahm Emanuel would acknowledge that he was not ready on day one.
He
and there are a
apparently
lot
seems to be saying that now.
Yes, and there were a lot of aldermen who were like, he's going to need to be broken in, as they put it.
And because he was not ready, he really underestimated how difficult it would be to deal with issues. I remember running into him less than a year into his term at a function, and it was the first time I had spoken to him. And I pulled him aside and I said, you're doing all right so far. You're getting lots of positive press, but there's some serious problems here because we were on the west side at the time in the neighborhoods that need to be addressed. And he just kind of smirked and didn't say anything else. I remember that encounter. And I really think that Emmanuel has a good heart. I really think he does. I really think he genuinely cared about all those killings, particularly of young people, all killings in general. But I don't want to say he was at a loss. I would say that he just knew that his office could not solve those problems, and that he couldn't possibly ever have the command of the kinds of resources and policies at the federal level, at the state level, at the county level that he needed in order to really make a significant dent. And when you ask who can do that, I don't think any one of those individuals knows at this point how to do that. Because I don't want to call these problems intractable, but that's why I say make a dent, because it just requires a combination of a whole bunch of different resources. And I asked you in the campaign, how could it be in a city with some of the best minds, the best universities, University of Chicago, all these public policy institutes, all these people, and with the resources and the richness that this city has, it's internationally, how could it be that we can't make the dent? And yet we look at New York and we look at Los Angeles and we see that they were able to deal with some of the issues that we find here we can't deal with, like gang issues. I've yet to hear the answers. I know that they're all well-intentioned people, but they're going to have to really open things up that Emmanuel didn't do. Emmanuel felt that he could just navigate. He could manage.
A good manager.
A good manager. And through press conferences, and he can relay messages. It's going to take a whole lot more than that. And it's going to take a lot of people coming to the table. Some people have said that Tony Preckwinkle is capable of bringing more people to the table. I don't know that I've seen that at the county level. Some people have said that Chuy Garcia can bring people to the table. They're all untested. This is a different arena. So certainly Susana Mendoza as comptroller, she was a state rep and a comptroller. She was city clerk. I was city clerk. That city clerk's office is tiny compared to all the rest of city government. You cannot say that, I would not say that because I was city clerk, I could definitely manage the mayor's office. I probably said something along those lines when I was running for mayor, but I wouldn't say that now.
I would say, ready on day one, that we would not be able to discount and count out Willie Wilson. We have to think about his business acumen. He is self-made. He's not self-made like one of the Jenner kids, but he's actually a self-made millionaire. He's, run these businesses still, multimillionaire. Fiscally, I think he has the business acumen to go in there day one to be ready for that. Now, for everything else, like you were mentioning, he may need to have the good team around him, but business-wise, fiscally, I think he would be ready on day one.
Do you think he understands this kind of high-flying finance that we've been seeing lately with Rahm Emanuel talking about? What are they, pension obligation bonds and all that?
Good old POB.
I do. I do. I really do think that he understands all of that, and I just don't think that he gets his fair share of being taken seriously by the media or, just by residents, period.
He certainly has he has a constituency. There's no question about that. We should probably, there are so many other things about the mayor's race that I know we could talk about for a long time, but let's move on to this police consent decree, because I think that it's probably almost as important as the mayor's race at this particular point in time because of all of the implications of what it brings out. And I just wanted to ask you about something that I observed that this may just be my own observation, but when Rahm Emanuel and Attorney General Madigan first announced that they were putting this thing together, or not first announced, but somewhere along the line, they said, we've got an agreement on everything except pointing guns, which meant they didn't really have an agreement, but they had much of an agreement. And then there was the problem with the decision about whether a police officer should record when he or she pulls a gun on someone was the sticking point. And Eddie Johnson was standing there with him, my recollection is, saying, this is a real problem for us at the police department. We don't want this. That's the way I think I heard it. And then, a few weeks later, Rahm Emanuel, 2 days after Rahm Emanuel announces he's not running for mayor, he's out there saying, oh, guess what? We're okay with this. We're going to do this. And he's got his police superintendent standing there with him saying, yeah, this is fine with me. So something big happened there. And what I'm trying to get at is a couple of things. First of all, is Rahm Emanuel turning into the Rahm Emanuel he always wanted to be because he's now free of being reelected? And can we actually see him maybe doing some progressive things in the next 3 months, 4 months, 5 months?
8 months.
8 months, sorry. 8 months, that's right, 8 months. And secondly, what is this thing with his police superintendent who just agrees with everything he says? Panel.
Well,
I was curious about the exact same thing. And the reason Eddie Johnson said he didn't necessarily want this rule right away, even though it's required in several other police departments of this size, is that he didn't want his officers to hesitate. And I remember seeing the response immediately on Twitter was, maybe you should hesitate. The Chicago Police Department has a problem with shooting people. That's the reason we're at this consent decree. I've been wondering the exact same thing. Is Rahm Emanuel unleashed? Does he feel like he doesn't need to win over the police vote at this point anymore so he can be a little bit tougher in this consent decree negotiation? I don't know. I think once this budget gets put out next month, we'll see how much money is dedicated to this consent decree. I think there's a City Club event a few weeks ago where the former police superintendent, John Escalante, said, I think we need to talk about how much this is going to cost to really make it work. It's going to be $40 million just to do promotions alone, not to mention the technology and every single else. It's a gigantic document. It's going to be very costly. I think this budget is going to be where we see where his priorities are. Emmanuel has said, I'm going to try to fit in 2.5 years of work into the next 8 months. And it will be interesting to see what he's like unleashed.
Well, but to stick with that budget thing for a moment, he did say in the last day or so that when you see my budget, you'll see that there is capacity for doing this. And in your reporting today, we see that the people, the companies, the firms, the entities that have submitted their bids to become the monitor, the people who will actually run this day to day, they're charging anywhere from about 6 to 20 million or something.
Over
right?
a 5-year period.
Over a 5-year period.
So
yeah.
the city has said we don't want them to spend, we don't want to spend any more than $2.85 million on these teams per year. But that's just for the monitoring team.
Right.
The technology, the promotions, the hiring necessary to pull this off is going to be a lot more than that.
But as you say, the things that it sets into motion, like promotions and everything else, will be very expensive.
Yes, and this is at the same time as we have to solve this massive pension problem,
Yeah.
which we don't know how that's going to be paid for yet.
And that's why I think Eddie Johnson is already trying to lower expectations and saying that this is going to take time.
Yeah.
This is going to take many, many years.
Yeah.
But my concern is, okay, with the mayor who agreed to this gone, with the attorney general who agreed to this gone, what are the decisions that are going to be made in the future that are either going to delay implementation or accelerate the process, because it will be timely. But the cost of the monitor reminds me of what happened with the Shackman court monitors, where
it's
that
40
dragged
years
on
later,
years and millions and millions of dollars that were paid to these lawyers to monitor this thing. I hope the same thing doesn't happen here.
And certainly the Board of Education consent decree, that went on for a generation.
But in terms of being freed up by now running for office, I'm not so sure we'd have a consent decree if Lisa Madigan was running for re-election and Emmanuel.
Oh, very interesting. So she was. It was Lisa Madigan unleashed
in
that
both
got
cases,
the thing started.
I think they were both unleashed.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
to do the right thing,
Yeah.
unleashed to do the right thing.
Yeah. Which is a statement. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's a statement really about our electoral process. That if you really have strong opinions about something, you probably have to tuck them in your pocket in order
Well,
to get
it's
elected.
not just strong opinions. I mean, and it's how what is the FOP going to do?
Yeah.
They're going to continue to oppose this. You can see that the FOP president is in court with Van Dyke constantly.
Right.
They're going to defend their members no matter what, and so they're going to exert as much pressure as they can on these candidates.
Yeah. Didn't the FOP lose a big court thing just recently?
They have appealed, so they were trying to stop the consent decree altogether. They
That's
lost
what it
that
was.
initial battle and they've appealed.
They've appealed. Okay. I cut you off, Kathy. I don't
No,
know.
no.
All right. Another thing that's in the consent decree that's really interesting is this thing that Joe Ferguson was talking about yesterday, which has to do with having police officers in the schools, which has been, that's been for a very long time in some schools, I guess. But this all has echoes of everything else we've been hearing before, that Ferguson is saying that these school officers are not trained to be school officers, and that if they're going to continue to do it, they need to have special training. And it gets back to that famous word again, training, right? It's like, we don't seem to be doing a very good job of training our police.
30 years ago, when I first became state senator, my first term, there was a death that occurred in my district, a Latino family. The mother was having problems. The father had mental illness. She called the police. They showed up. This was on Costner and North Avenue, and they put him in a headlock, and they killed the guy. Back then, and I'm a member of the General Assembly, we were talking about the need for training officers to deal with people with mental illness.
Yeah.
They weren't equipped. There were all kinds of promises made. Here we are, still talking about the same thing.
Yeah.
And that was not the only incident I dealt with. I've dealt with a couple of incidents with individuals who were mentally ill. One fella had a butter knife, a butter knife in his hand, in a stairwell. He flashed it, and this was on Washington on Division Street, and he was killed. Again, a guy who was mentally ill. So the consent decree talks about training, but the amount of training and the quality of that training will be very important.
This may not be totally germane to that, but parallel to it, we've had Gary McCarthy on the show here, and he's been on other shows, and has been talking about Jerome Van Dyke and saying, again, paraphrasing here, but essentially what he says about Jerome Van Dyke is that when he first saw that video, he said to himself, I recognize that as a police professional. That's a panic response. That he got out of the car and just kind of lost it and unloaded his way. I mean, his former boss, the police superintendent, has said that on the record. So there again, I mean, isn't that a training issue? I mean, here's a guy who we now know, had never fired his weapon before. I don't know, I think he may have said he never unholstered his weapon. So the first time he does, he blows 16 bullets into a kid. I mean, if that's not a training issue, I don't know what is. So I don't know. So what's the answer? The answer does not appear to be spending $90 million on building a training academy.
There are officers who would argue with you about that it's impossible not to, it's very hard to get good training in a facility so run down and where guns are being left unlocked in rooms, and where we have to practice taser training in a hallway where we don't have enough tasers to work with everyone. We only have 2 people monitoring our body cam footage. There are officers who want that new training facility, and there are officers who want to be trained more and trained consistently and retrained every year, so that the automatic response isn't to get out of your car and shoot someone 16 times, but to diffuse the situation, use a taser, do anything except for use excessive force.
But can you train common sense, though? Because some of it, I would think some common sense would have to come up into play with some things, and that you can't train.
Yeah.
So.
But if it is, as McCarthy said, in this particular case, if it is a panic response, I think you can train for that, can't you? Can't you put people in situations where they're repeatedly put into these kinds of like emergency situations until they learn? No, you don't think so?
Maybe so, but if I'm thinking about Laquan McDonald, and he's down on the ground, and you fired your first shot, which took him down, are you still so panicked that he's on the ground, disarmed, and you just continue on with 15 more shots? I mean, how panicked are you still? Was he rising up? No. So I just can't buy it.
Do you think that a case like that is something that can or cannot be trained out of someone or into someone? Do you think that's beyond training? It's just a bad recruitment?
In that instance, that was beyond training. That was just I don't know what was going through his head. But he's on the ground. And if your other officers that were there to back you up didn't see the need to, I don't even know what you want to call it, while he's down there and he's out, then what do you panic for? What do you, I mean, I don't know.
The training helps to minimize the number of incidents like that, but it doesn't prevent all incidents like that. Because being a police officer, everyone acknowledges is a difficult job. And, I have family, relatives who are police officers, and the thing that's on their mind is, I want to get home to my family every evening. And so sometimes in cases where police officers say, I've never fired my gun, I haven't had, well, we just don't know how in a split second, in a fraction of a second, they're going to make a decision.
And that's all the more reason why we need these gun reports, because we need to know how often our police officers are pulling their guns. We don't even know that. and how many other Jerome Van Dykes are there out there that when that moment comes that they have to fire it for the first time, will they do it in a professional way?
Yeah. A lot of what training is about is getting to a place where you're so well trained that this doesn't even need to happen in the first place. And that also goes back to how communities engage with police and the needed implicit bias training, the need to do everything possible to restore trust between communities and the police. It's going to be a very long time till that trust is back and till we have a real solution to this. I'm very interested to hear what mayoral candidates have to say about how quickly we're going to act on this consent decree, and if the police department can communicate to the rank and file that they need to buy into this.
Will the consent decree make a difference?
It'll make some difference. Will it make enough difference? I don't think so.
I agree.
So all this fire and fury, and in the end, it might not make that much difference.
We've been there before.
Yeah.
What will make a difference is changing the environment for everyone involved.
Yeah.
You'd have to have fewer people out there on the street that are struggling with mental illness
Well, that's
without
for sure.
getting any kind of help.
Right.
You have to have fewer people on the street that are unemployed and resort to the drug trade in order to live and support their families, or all of that. You have to have better paying jobs so that people are not living in poverty while working in minimum wage jobs. You have to have better housing conditions, better health care overall. All of these things have to be addressed. You have to have better transportation.
So in fact,
and you have to have engagement, community engagement. I talked in my first mayoral campaign. I said, I'm going to be the first mayor to put money into community organizing. Politicians usually stay away from that because they're afraid that the organizing will end up running them out of office.
Right.
But that's good. What's the role of an alderman? The alderman should be organizing their entire districts, their entire wards. But that takes resources, and whether it's through block clubs, people need to be engaged, and that has to be done on a massive scale.
Yeah.
And that takes a whole different approach.
Well, you raise
at
a
City
really
Hall.
interesting question that I think has been on my mind for a long time. I remember I was working for the city when the 311 Center opened. And I know there was some discussion about this at the time, but I remember saying to people, well, this is the end of aldermen, because if you get a good high-tech system, and it wasn't at that time, but it has been growing and getting better and better. Your street light is out. It's just you just pick up your phone, and then you get a response back saying that it's in the queue and all that. And you don't have to like call your alderman and beg them to send somebody out to fix your street light. But they're still important. I think the role of aldermen has changed a lot in the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And it raises...
And public safety should be their number one
That's exactly
priority.
right. That's exactly right. And what I think is becoming really interesting is the thought that, you could run this with any number of these potential mayors. I mean, we haven't even mentioned Lori Lightfoot, but Lori Lightfoot, Tony Preckwinkle, Susanna Mendoza. Any of these people who come in, they're going to have a completely different relationship with that city council than the one that Rahm Emanuel has, that he inherited from Daley. I think all the aldermen are going to be saying, this is it now. We do not have to pay attention to any of these mayoral candidates. They're all midgets. We will run this city. By the way, did we ever mention to you that it's a strong city council, weak mayor city? That may be what happens. We may end up with a real weak mayor.
That depends on city council organizing itself enough to get stuff done. We have a progressive caucus that I think is 13 members. I guarantee we'll see it grow. We have actually a few candidates running for aldermen who come from a community organizing background, some who are associated with the Democratic Socialists of America, which is very interesting. I'm interested to see what coalitions are built in this new city council, how many of the long-timers who have been there since the 80s or 90s, or in Ed Burke's case, the 60s, retire, how much institutional knowledge we lose along with that. if Pat O'Connor and Marge Lorino and Ed Burke all leave this term, we're losing decades and decades of institutional knowledge. But also,
but we're also losing individuals who have been gatekeepers.
Correct.
Yep.
And if the structure of the council doesn't change, and if Ed Burke continues to control a lot of things that make aldermen dependent on him, then not a whole lot is going to change. And then not only are aldermen dependent on him, but then the mayor, whoever the mayor is, becomes dependent on Ed Burke. And that, I think, if you ask me what's the biggest change that's necessary in the council, that's it.
Well, I mean, if you think about it,
I'm very passionate about that.
yes, and should be. I mean, look back at the election of Harold Washington. It took about 15 minutes for the city council to reorganize itself historically from being this, rubber stamp to running the city. It didn't take very long. So I guess that's kind of the essence of my question is like, would that happen to a Tony Preckwinkle? Would it happen to a Chuy Garcia? Would it happen to a Lori Lightfoot?
I don't know.
I'm interested to see if any of these candidates, when they get in and establish themselves, are they going to run on a slate and say,
yeah.
hey, Scott Wagsback, hey, John Arena,
yeah.
let's get this progressive slate going and elect people that you like in wards nearby.
You just mentioned John Arena, and again, quoting back some of your reporting, I was interested to see today that the 5150 project might be moving forward. We've talked about that a lot. That's up in Portage Park, a very controversial project. And lots of powerful people have tried to stop it all along the way. And John Arena has just fought it, and now he's...
Well, it still depends on tax credits. We'll see if those tax credits come through. But yeah, that's been one of the most interesting ward-specific and area-specific battles to watch. And affordable housing on the Northwest side it's just been really, really contentious. And I'm anxious to see if a similar fight happens in the 41st Ward near O'Hare Airport with Alderman Anthony Napolitano.
Yeah. At this point, I guess we haven't actually gone around the table and asked what you think is going to happen with Jason Van Dyke. Now that we know that there's a jury, we know the trial is going to proceed. Is he going to, what's going to happen to him?
I'm up in the air. I'm not surprised that he chose to go for the jury instead of a bench trial because of the makeup of the jury now. You have one black person. Is it 2 or 3 Latinos? And then everyone else is white.
Yeah. 7 whites, I think.
And then the one Latino, she is a CPD applicant. So I think that his camp is like maybe depending on her wanting to be a cop since 12 years old and trying to put herself in his shoes. I think they're banking on that. And then you just have one black person. And from all of the accounts that I've read from the reporting from the Sun-Times team is all of the other black, potential jurors, they use their preemptive strikes and they're not there. So
both sides used almost all of their preemptory challenges, I think, right? Yeah.
But I mean, they use most of theirs on, people of color. And once I saw the makeup of the jury, I was just like, yeah, he's going to go for the jury trial. There was just no question in my mind.
You think he's got a good shot of being acquitted? Is that what
I think that he thinks he has a good shot of being acquitted based on the makeup of the jury now.
Okay.
So it's going to be very interesting. I don't want to say I'm going to be cautiously optimistic of what the outcome will be, but it'll be very interesting. But I'm not surprised that he chose the jury trial.
Edie?
I'm not crime in courts. I've just been very interested to follow Judge Gaughan's past with he had his own confrontation with police when he was a veteran returning from Vietnam. So if it did go to bench trial, I was very interested to see how that would color Jason Van Dyke's trial. But I don't know. I'll be watching closely. Sun-Times and Trib reporting.
So you're not seeing there's no like bright light flashing saying this and this because it does feel like it's anyway. Sorry.
Yeah, I thought he'd go for a bench trial. So I was wrong. But to me, it's an open and shut case. But we don't know what
meaning that you think that the jury is going to convict him?
I think the jury should convict him But I
That's
I'm not
a
saying
different answer.
that I'm not saying that they will.
Yeah,
All you need is one.
Well, but you obviously had questions, or you wouldn't have thought that he would go for,
That's
for
right.
a bench trial.
I think that because of all the exposure that this case has gotten, how could there be anyone on that jury that doesn't know?
Yeah.
I know that they were interviewed and they gave their responses, but you know, I've been interviewed for juries before, and you know, you're careful when you answer the questions, very careful. But with the video being there, even though the FOP says it's just one angle, it's just, to me, it's an open and shut case.
But if one juror says no, then it hangs, and if the jury is hung, then it's entirely possible that the case would never get retrialed, and
That's right.
And Jerome.
That's right.
Jerome.
That's right.
Van Dyke. Sorry, Jerome Van Dyke would just walk.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, we have 30 seconds left. The question is, will Bruce Rauner get reelected?
No.
No.
Polling's not there at this time, but there could be another Blago tape. Who knows?
Okay, all right. I'm starting to think that maybe there's a chance.
If
but
he has it, he's waiting too long.
he's waiting. Yeah, that's right. That's right. It should have been out by now. That's right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. This has been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed having you here, and hope you'll all come back again. Kathy Chaney from the Chicago Sun-Times and recent Studs Terkel Award winner. Glad to have you here today, and hope you come back again sometime. Miguel Del Valle, former, but right now a very happily retired guy with lots of opinions, and
I was freed up.
Yeah, and incredibly right. Just like Rahm Emanuel, he can come to our
To
table
say what I
and say
think.
what he thinks. That's right. And A.D. Quig, who cannot because she's still employed as a
I'm also not running for mayor.
A working reporter. Well, that's what you say now.
Or clerk, or treasurer, or 46th ward alderman.
That's what you say now. All right. Thank you all. We'll see you next time. I'm Ken Davis. You've been watching Chicago Newsroom. Remember, you can go to this address and you can see all of our shows. They're all archived right there. Or go to chicagonewsroom.org and you can see and hear, or you can also listen to them on the earbuds, which sometimes is a better way than just sitting watching TV. You get out and exercise. See you next week. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.